Rana. I'm a Sanskritist, and I work on figures of speech, ornaments of speech in Sanskrit. And I'm also a student of many people who sit around the table, including Joseph Stern, with whom I took a class many years ago.
Hi, I'm Sivan Goran-Anzuni. I'm a postdoctoral student here at FIBRU, and I work on Manipravalam, which is a literary language from Kerala, mixing Sanskrit and the spoken language. I also work on Sanskrit from Kerala. I'm also a student of many of the people here. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, normally I was trained in linguistics in India, BSc, and in traditional grammar literature in India. I worked many years at the Central Institute of Indian Languages in Mysore. After retirement, I have been working around the world. My last station was in Gary. Currently, I'm in the project of the.
And I am Gary Taub at the University of Chicago. I do Sanskrit things, and I try to do them as often as possible with Igal and David. And the most relevant thing is how delighted I am to be back in this building, and not only sitting next to Professor Annamalai, but sitting directly across from a former director of this institute.
But his picture is no longer in the room.
Thank God.
Oh, it's no longer there.
Fortunately, yeah.
I remember the first time I came, we tried to get flowers to garland the portrait of you, but we were told that in Israel, that's not an auspicious thing to do.
Hello everyone, I'm Naresh Kirti. I teach in Ashoka University in New Delhi. After having spent many happy years here in Jerusalem, I work in Sanskrit literature, poetics, and also Kannada grammar.
My name is Sarat Zweig. I'm a PhD student at the university, and I work on Quranic commentaries and parallels in many different.
My name is Punya Gupta. I'm at Yale University. I'm actually an undergrad, so in my 4th year, and I try to do Sanskrit things, and I'm also interested in South India intellectual history as well as Sanskrit in Southeast Asia.
I'm Yatan Aziz. I'm a master's student at Tel Aviv University. I study modern Japanese history and language learning in Japan during the early modern period.
Hi everybody, I'm Nina, she's a student here at the university, and I'm working on algebra literature and poetics.
Lots of things on the intellectual history of blues from the book.
I'm a doctoral student at Pergamon University. I work on mostly poly texts.
I'm a doctoral student at Athete University of America.
Chicago. I studied Sanskrit grammar before I kind of do because studying what is traditions.
I'm Joan Burrow. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, and I study Sanskrit grammar and also how it was taught in the 70s.
So, I'm a master's student at the university, and I work on South classical music. It also has this kind of grammar. Yeah, I have a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and also
My name is Margherita Trento. I mostly historian of South India, but I work with Tamil. History, and I am teaching at the College of
I'm Sandro De Pardi. I'm a researcher at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and I deal with early modern grammar of Chinese, published in Europe.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. This seems to be the perfect group to talk about grammar wars. I think we're going to take about 10 minutes. Yigal and I just for a few introductory remarks, and then we'll move to so I wanted to start by saying a few words about the title of this school, Grammar Wars, because I have a feeling that some of us here were somewhat ill at ease at the martial belligerent title. I mean, do people actually fight wars over grammar? Actually, I think they do, especially if you think of grammar in a kind of wider sense. But I can tell you in terms of how we came to choose this title. I mean, Yigal and I deal with India, South Asia, and in South Asia, I think it's a very apt description to say that the grammarians, at least in the narrative traditions, not talking about the grammatical texts per se, but the kind of penumbra around them, they tend to be extremely aggressive and belligerent, so much so that the idea is that any given grammarian who thinks himself worthy will try to eradicate the grammars of his predecessors. I'll be telling you more about that this afternoon. So grammar wars in India, actually, I mean, that's a kind of natural thing. It may not sound quite so natural in the Mediterranean world or in Europe, I don't know, or in China, we'll see. In India, part of the logic of this has to do with the potency of language, tremendous, could call it metaphysical or magical potency of language, because as we all know, language impacts upon reality, sometimes in wonderful ways and sometimes in possibly very destructive ways. When I used to teach first-year Sanskrit, I would usually begin the very first lesson trying to impress upon the students that they had to learn to pronounce Sanskrit properly and carefully. And so there's a well-known story about a demon, poor fellow. He wanted, his name was Trishiras, he wanted to destroy Indra, the king of the gods. And he was using mantric utterances, and he described himself as Indra Shatru, that is to say, the enemy of Indra. But he made a terrible mistake because there's a question of where the pitch accent lies in a compound like Indra Shatru. If the pitch accent is delayed to the end of the compound, then it means indeed the enemy of Indra. But if the pitch accent is on, the high accent is on the first syllable, then it's a Babuvrihi compound, and it means somebody who Indra wants to kill. And indeed, that's what happened. Indra came and killed him. So that's a grammatical point, and you can kind of see the potential harmful effects of making a mistake in grammar. These are the pragmatics, one version of the pragmatics of the grammatical world in Sanskrit, actually in all of the Indian languages. And I think it's a general human theme, actually. If we go, if we look at the Jewish traditions, so we have Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah, possibly the most interesting book the Jews ever produced. And it's very much along the same lines of somehow impacting upon reality by playing with this syllables. It's a kind of pragmatic phonological magic. And we would easily be able to continue this theme into the Arabic and Persian grammarians, not merely the magical potency of languages and syllables, that's certainly there, Sarah could tell us about it, but also these have to do, I mean, there are questions of, let's call them cultural identity and where one language ends and another language begins, and what a mixture, let us say, of Arabic and Persian grammar might look like and feel, and so on. And I still haven't said anything about the very prevalent historical experience where an alien grammar is somehow forced upon a resistant language of another language family. We'll be hearing about this in terms of China. It's also true of Tibet and the use of Sanskrit grammar to make sense of Tibetan, which is very resistant to it. And it's also true in Java, where Sanskrit was used somehow as a template for Old Javanese, even though these are languages that don't really, it's very compatible. So let me just say by way of ending these introductory remarks, I hope you can now see why grammar wars might be a suitable topic, whether the war is an, like kind of out and out military campaign, or whether it's a acrimonious intellectual debate, which might go on for generations, which was the case in Tamil, for example, with Sanskrit and so on. And all of this has a lot to do with the very basic notion of normativity per se, with rule-bound language and the teachers of rule-bound language and the meanings of having linguistic rules and what happens if you don't obey the rules. I'll be talking about that later this afternoon.
Can I just jump in with a more violent example?
Yeah.
Many of you know this story. It's probably apocryphal, but I think it's, from my understanding, it is based on some truth. That at the end of the Second World War, after the first atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, the Americans sent a telegram to the emperor himself, demanding unconditional surrender. The answer came back in typical classical Japanese that loves double and triple negatives. It was misinterpreted. It was misinterpreted to mean no when it meant maybe. Then came the second bomb.
An example. By the way, I meant to say at the beginning that anybody who studied linguistics at the Hebrew University in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, I was there, knows the depth of hostility between potential, let's call them linguistic or grammatical schools of thought. There were the, let's call them the historical structuralists in the Middle European humanistic tradition. And then there were the very modern Chomskyan or post-Chomskyan generative linguists. And the level of hatred between these two groups was so intense that they had to be separated and put into different departments. And when in the early 21st century, a dean decided to unite them, we were afraid that this was going to be the beginning of the Third World War. That didn't happen, but that doesn't mean it was a harmonious union. Maybe when Eitan Grossman comes today, he can tell us more about that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll be brief. First of all, I want to thank all of you. And it's so wonderful to see you. And it's kind of unbelievable, in fact, after the years of planning this. And I also want to thank Itzik and Tony Grafton, who believed in this project from the beginning and did not lose faith in it when we ourselves tended to lose faith during these early years. And also Anat and Ilana and Iris and the entire staff of this wonderful institute. It's so good to be back and see the renovated and beautiful spaces of the institute and so welcome. Thank you so much. David spoke about wars. I'll speak a little bit about the grammar. and I don't pretend to know what grammar is, but I think that for the purposes of the coming 5 days, we'll define it in the broadest possible terms to allow frauds such as myself to participate. So let's say that grammar is any system or model that either explicitly or implicitly explains, theorizes, regulates, enables, or silences expression, expressivity, and conceptualization in any form. Let's say that it can be a theory about language that any child develops in or it can be an academic theory, or it can be a political theory, one that originates either from the center, from the streets, from the centers of power, revolutionary force, and it can be or claim to be universal, explaining all languages, or it can be limited to one language or one subset of that, or both. and it can be theoretical, and it can be normative, and it can be generative, and it can be all of the above. And it can pertain to everyday language, literary language, official language, musical language, all of these are for the relations between them. Which is an important point. And it can reflect a certain reality, social, political, psychological, epistemological, ontological, or it can also create, build, maintain such a reality and defend it against competing systems. So it can be. So we can say if we wanted to make a kind of a bold argument, and I think we would to set this 5-day school, that every change in the order of the world then is either accompanied by, preceded by, or even triggered by, or at least followed by a revision to grammar in some broad sense, or an attempt to understand and create an isomorphism between word and world, language. So I think that also explains why grammar, if we conceive of it in these broad terms, is a highly contested stations flare up beyond what is initially intended, or precisely as initially intended. So that said, I think despite the kind of belligerent title of the school, we wanted to be as amicable as possible. and so we wanted to be less lectury and more open for discussion. Notice that we didn't, this is going to be informal. We're not going to have like formal chairs for each session. We're not going to give bios. We're not, each person is up to his or her own devices. We'll just flow with this. It's going to be just friendly, informal, lots of good time, lots of outings. There's going to be a movie, a reception tonight, a movie and pizza tomorrow night, a tour of Jaffa on Tuesday. A lot of fun activities that I think will help create the opposite of war. So thank you again all for coming, making the effort to join us from wherever you came. And with that, I think we'll turn over to Lucy for the first talk of the day.
You should have brought them with you. There are a lot of people here.
That was just something you said.
It's impressive.
Just start.
We began.
Okay, so I will actually start. Should I?
These are all copies of one page, right?
The brief is just one. And then there's another handout with letters on it. With vowels. I think that's just over there, the first pile. And then you can also take it last one. I think it's the first pile on the right hand side. I think this is on the handout. Yes. No, it's this one. This is the one for this one. Okay, I read this. I read it this morning. You're ahead of me. And he does.
So this is
We will start now.
Yes. So let me start by saying that I'm very happy to be here. I took my assignment very seriously in two senses. One is I heard that there's a summer school, so I really interpreted this to mean that I am going to learn a lot here, and not only from all the Sankritists and so on, but also from the Greek linguists. I'm myself not a linguist, as we just heard from following the steps of Athete. I have dealt a lot with the Greek language, in particular in Hellenistic Judaism, and I have also been very interested in the connection between the Greek grammarians and the Jewish interpreters of the Bible, and I've also been interested in issues of language contact, namely between Latin and Greek, Romanization of Greek, and also in rabbinic literature, the absorption of Greek and Latin loanwords. And I've recently come across really interesting and unnoticed phenomena of the rabbinic Hebrew actually reflecting a kind of Roman use of Greek words. So I have been really fascinated by these questions, but I haven't looked at grammar per se. So I hope to learn from you and present some materials which I hope can really prompt a lively discussion and contribute to my own understanding, moving beyond what I have done so far. Secondly, I have taken the issue of wars very seriously, and I looked for something where I could really respond to the title of this workshop. And I thought, oh, it might be a good thing to find out about the kind of the mythological war between the Greek grammarians that in some way perhaps define a very crucial moment in early Western civilization, namely when Greek grammar in a way was born, developed also, among others, as a result of two schools responding to each other, fighting with each other. And these two schools, namely the school of Alexandria and the school of Pergamon, they represent not only different grammatical schools, but they also represent different hermeneutical approaches to the canonical text of Homer. Alexandria represents the literal approach, where the text is probably for the first time investigated in a mode that we still consider, following the Alexandrians, as a kind of scientific mode, namely a mode that tries to figure out what the author had intended with his text. And they also try to see the text sometimes even in its historical context. So obviously today we can kind of smile and say, well, Homer didn't really speak kind of either Koine or Athenian Greek, but they try to appreciate Homer in his language in his historical context. And the interpretation was also based on the literal, and it was informed by cultural and other considerations. By contrast, the school in Pergamon founded by Krates of Malon, was really into allegorical interpretation, where the authorial intention was much more in the background. And in some ways, the interpreter kind of unearthed the subconscious of the text, not very concerned, or often not very concerned about the intention, the conscious intention of the author. And here then, for example, etymologies could in fact provide a tool to get behind the conscious intention of the author and really unearth some other interpretations that we today usually kind of identify, and I suspect also disqualify as kind of eisegesis, namely things that people kind of brought into the text without the author really intending this to be so. So when I try to learn about this mythological fight between the Alexandrians and the grammarians at Pergamon, the first thing I found out is that the talk about this war between the grammarians seems to begin rather late. because the first thing that I did, in fact, was I looked up in the scholia to Homer, the Iliad, where that's actually our access point to the Alexandrian scholars, given the fact that their own works, their own commentaries have not survived. So our access point to the Alexandrians' work is the scholia from different ages, and they usually reflect later compilations. I won't go into all the details, but basically it's the Erbster edition that we have of all the different scholia, and there in particular the A scholia that come from the Venetus manuscript of the Iliad, reflecting the earliest layer of the scholia going back to Aristarchus, the greatest of the Alexandrian grammarians. And when I looked up the key term that really informs this grammar war, namely between analogy and anomaly, I discovered to my greatest surprise that there wasn't any quotation directly from Aristarchus using analogia, but it was really from his student, Herodian, or later, he's a 2nd century, but in that tradition, in the Aristotelian tradition, where the term came up. And then, even to my greater surprise, I found out that Herodian wasn't even reporting on Aristeas, but he was usually disagreeing with him and saying, well, he didn't really do it according to analogia, but here is the real analogia, and that's how it should be. That's how it should be done. So when I started to find out about this, it became very quickly very clear that this is a kind of a minefield that is not very clear when exactly the method was named thus, when the dichotomy between Alexandria and Pergamon was set up, and whether perhaps the protagonists themselves operated along different lines, or perhaps weren't even that aware of the differences, or perhaps spoke on different levels and addressed different things. And it is only kind of retrospectively that this came to be seen as a war on exactly the same issue. So the first and most famous report about this war comes from Varro, and he's 1st century BC Roman grammarian polymath, and we have his 6 of his 23 volumes on the Latin language we have. And it is Varro who positions himself as a grammarian in a way between the 2 schools. And he's the first really to bring up examples and to explain the issue at hand. But as you will see, he too does it with not with very much detail. So the most explicit description that I found is in book 9 in the Latin language. And what he says is the following: in this position was the famous grammarian Krates, who placed his reliance on Chrysippus. Chrysippus is the 3rd head of the Stoic school, and he's in fact the one who is often credited to have really invented the Stoic school, because the early Stoics, in particular Zeno, were very much indebted to the Cynics, and they didn't have much theory. In some ways, they were kind of anti-convention, anti-theory, and it was Chrysippus who invented Stoic logic. He also was the one who really gave a philosophical justification for the encyclical studies, which included grammar. And so the grammar was raised to a philosophical level by Chrysippus, and no longer despised as a kind of boring thing as the Cynics would have it. So we have Krates, who became the head of the school in Pergamon, and he's described here by Varro in line with Chrysippus, the Stoic. A man of great acumen who left 3 books on anomaly and contended against regularity and Aristarchus, but in such a way as his writings show that he does not seem to have understood thoroughly the intent of either. Varro sets up Krates as somebody who follows Chrysippus and opposes Aristarchus, but as Varro hastens to say, he didn't really get either of them very properly. Now, unfortunately, Chrysippus's works have not survived. He wrote many, many works. None of them has survived. So we are always dependent on later reports, very often very detailed report in Diogenes Laertius from the 3rd century. But we can't check his own words in a proper way. So, and then he explains for Chrysippus, when he writes about the inconsistency of speech, has as its object the showing that like things are denoted by unlike words. So 2 different words can mean like things, and that unlike things are denoted by like words. And Aristarchus, by contrast, when he writes about the consistency of the same, bids us follow a certain likeness of words in their derivation as far as usage permits. So we have already this addition that here in the Latin it's constitutio, the usage permits. So Varro already gives us a sign that even Aristarchus, who's identified as the great person of analogy, namely of rules derived and that apply to the language and that have some normative value, at the same time he already says as far as usage permits. So we see here already from Varro's perspective that the situation is perhaps more complicated than we may have thought at first sight. Very quickly, we see in Varro that his main interest, and that's also the way that he shapes the discussion between the 2 schools, is really about the oral dimension of language and the written dimension of language, and he associates theory with the written and the spoken language with irregularity, and he wonders what the connection between the 2 in fact is, and whether everybody should be obliged by the theory that emerges from the written and that is also presupposed in some ways by the written word. Now you can see in Varro that there is a lively debate in 1st century BCE Rome going on about this, and that there is also a kind of an orientation towards the spoken and towards what comes through in Varro very clearly, a more kind of individualistic approach, or to put it in a modern or perhaps even Aristotelian terms, poetic license. In other words, to what extent can an author or an individual speaking or writing, can they actually kind of shape their own language and depart from certain rules that may apply otherwise to their language. So on page 443 in paragraph 5, so you see that there is the issue of the usage of the people as a whole. Others belong to individual persons. So we have this distinction between individual language and kind of national language. The words of an orator and those of the poet are not the same. And it is very clear that regularity should not be so imposing that it can actually limit the expression of individuals. So regularity is said merely to exist, or is it said to appreciate whether regularity is merely said to exist, or is it said that we ought to follow it? So here we have another really interesting distinction between kind of the rules of grammar as something that we can actually kind of, when we listen to spoken language or see written language, either way, we can actually observe certain regularities, things that recur. And then a second question, not necessarily connected to this, is the question whether there is some kind of norm and the authority of the grammarians, of the regularity that has been established to actually direct further speaking and writing. Further on, and perhaps we shouldn't take the time to go through all the paragraphs. I gave you a huge handout, and that's basically for your pleasure time after this session. There are many examples, sometimes from the Latin, sometimes from the Greek. Basically, what is important to me are 2 points. One is, for example, on page 425, you see that the fight between the regularists and the animalists revolves around specific examples. So whenever you get somebody who has put, for example, in the middle of the page 425, there are words that are like gens, mens, dens. Right, so they have the same amount of syllables, they have the same morphology, and yet their genitives and accusatives in the plural are unlike. So this is the fight between the animalists and the regularists, where the animalists would then always be ready with one example that disproves the rule and ask for another explanation. Now, the wisdom of the regularists would always consist, and this is really crucial, what paradigm to choose, right? What is the right paradigm to choose for the rule that you actually wish to apply? And so whenever we have a dispute between the 2 schools, then the question is whether perhaps there is a better paradigm by which this particular word can be explained and derive its declination from. Right, so that's a kind of a typical dispute, and then we have later on some really cute passages where the kind of diversity of language and the anonymity of language is compared to the kind of diversity of furniture, diversity of clothes that we like to wear. And there is some kind of a rhetorical move to say, oh, come on, as you wouldn't like to wear the same dress all the time, you shouldn't be restricted to kind of using the same odd rule all the time, and thus make language really boring and not very interesting. So there's this kind of rhetorical move to allow for diversity, creativity, and some kind of individual intervention with language. So that's where Varro stands, and he in a way tries to combine the 2 schools. He says, yes, there are regularities in the language and they don't need to be kind of imposed, but they actually are there. We just need to recognize them in the spoken and written language. And then we also allow for creativity, and it is in fact very often the kind of departure from the rules that makes for good poetry and that makes for a more exquisite literary expression. Now, when I read all this, I went back to the Homeric scholia, and I tried to see what the traces for this debate in fact are. And I came away with a very different impression. And it seems to me that the war that Varro describes, at least from an Alexandrian perspective, and that's the perspective that I'm more familiar with, wasn't really there historically. And that's really for 2 reasons. One is, in Alexandria, we don't just have one school, but it's really a great variety. We have different generations of grammarians, and each of them takes a slightly different approach. So from an internal Alexandrian perspective, it's very difficult to speak about one approach. And in fact, we may even speak about the grammar wars between the Alexandrian grammarians, not just between the Alexandrians and the ones in Pergamon. And in some ways, it sometimes even seems that the war among the Alexandrians was even fiercer, because they were all sitting in the same city and they were really fighting for predominance among their constituency, whereas the grammarians in Pergamon, they were far away. In any case, they belonged to a rival kingdom, and sometimes one gets the impression that what they said was in any case so absurd in the eyes of some of the leading Alexandrians that they may not have cared so much what was said over there. Now, was in any case in the other place where this was kind of mentioned. Whereas the internal Alexandrian fights were really fierce. And one of the things that was really at issue was the text, the precise and the correct text of Homer. And I will get to this in just a second. So we have internal Alexandrian fights, and we have, as I said already, the remarkable absence of the term analogia in the fragments that have survived. And of course, we always have to take into account that there may be fragments, millions of fragments out there that have not survived, and the term was perhaps dominant there. We don't know. But in any case, as far as the fragments, the extant texts go, it's really Dionysius Thrax, Aristarchus' immediate student, and then Herodian in the 2nd century CE, that the term becomes a key term in the grammatical discussions. So I'm moving now to the Greek handout, and the examples here, also the translation, are taken from a very important book by Francesca Spironi, Aristarchus, the Best of Grammarians, which is really a breakthrough in the scholarship on Aristarchus, as she has really for the first time put together all the different aspects of his work in a book of, I think, 800 pages or something. It's a huge achievement. So trying to figure out what Aristarchus may have meant by analogia, by analogy, really requires us to look at his examples and to study particular cases of the ones that have survived. And again, analogia in Greek, of course, was already a term that existed long before the grammarians put it to this particular use. It was particularly common in mathematics and also in geography, where basically it means proportion. Right. And for example, Philo of Alexandria, my favorite author, I looked up the word analogia, of course, in his work as well. And he uses it really with regard to geography. That's where analogia comes in, when you have the right proportions. And he even uses it with regard to the whole universe, that the universe is well proportioned. So that's where analogia comes in. So we have to be aware that the term itself is a common kind of scientific Greek term, and in the 1st century BCE and CE, it came to be used as a technical term in grammar. But the principle of analogia is already evident in Aristarchus, the best of grammarians. And perhaps just a word about him. Aristarchus was famous for knowing already in his very early age all of Greek literature, particularly the Iliad and the Odyssey by heart. He would just walk around and quote them. He established, even though again we don't have direct evidence by him, but only later about him, but he very clearly, from the fragments we can tell, established the principle that you explain Homer through Homer. So it is an internal literary analysis, and we will see that this also applies to his view of grammar. It is not independent grammatical rules that can be applied to Homer, but rather we learn Greek grammar from Homer himself. So he's our guideline, and he needs to be studied very carefully in his whole complexity to find out the rules of Greek grammar, which can then be applied to certain cases which are not so clear from a grammatical point of view. Aristarchus is responsible for the Homeric text, basically as we have it today. He established the text, and he also basically superseded the text of Xenodotus and other earlier versions, which had a much greater variety of verses, and it's basically his text that we still use today. And if you look at the Oxford edition of the Iliad, you will always see his name, and as if he was a modern scholar. It's really quite impressive that after so many, more than 2,000 years, he is still the recognized authority for the text. Aristarchus also produced 2 commentaries on the Iliad, and apparently edited himself a little bit, revised his earlier edition, and had the commentaries. He improved. Already his predecessors had already started, but he improved, and again he canonized a certain system of signaling his textual work, and so we would have the critical edition, and then in a different scroll we would have his commentaries, where he would always point to a specific line and then mark by the specific technical sign what the problem was that he had identified, and probably the most famous is the one for the athetesis. And we have one example of athetesis on the bottom of your handout in Scholion 1084. You can see there is a quotation of the line from the Iliad, and then it says athetetai, right? So athetetai, which was always marked by the obelus, means that Aristarchus marked this line as not authentic. So he suspected, in other words, that this particular line was added by a later scribe. And as you can see here in Schironi's translation, she keeps the word. The line is athetized. And because this is a really important word, because the Aristarchus did not omit the line, but he marked it as non-authentic, so that the text still retains the line that he considered unauthentic, but he marked it by the obelus. And then you see here Athete Hottie, and then he explains why he actually athetized the word or the line, and his corrections of the text were always guided by a very profound study of the whole corpus and grammatical considerations. So that's what we have. Yes. So let's look at some examples. So we start with a kind of a simple example where there is a kind of a simple analogy between 2 types. That's the Scholion Iliad 17,539b, and B refers you to the type of scholia that we have here, this is part of the exegetical scholia. So the question that we have here is the accent of the participle katapethnon, and you see that Aristarchus read katapethnon with the accent on the pethnon, and he derives it, or he justifies it, by analogy to another participle, namely temnon. Okay, so that's what we have in the you see that the fragment is very short. It's simply Aristarchus hos temnon. That's it. That's what we have. As Francesca Schironi has explained here, the problem is the problem of the accent, whether it should be on the epsilon or on the omicron, omega. And this is, of course, a question of what kind of root we have here. how should we reconstruct the root of the verb, and then we have the analogy, and the solution is kata hefnon. So so that's the first kind of very simple analogy, and as you will see, the temnon is similar. It doesn't have the preposition kata as the word in question has, but it actually follows the same rule. So you can see here the choice of the paradigm is the crucial thing here, right? What kind of paradigm do we apply to the verb in question? So the next example is similar. The question is how to put, what kind of accent to put on stenachon. And one other thing that I should perhaps mention is that in the ancient Greek script, the letters were capital letters, and the questions of the accent became particularly crucial in cases of doubt. So that's when you really wanted already at an early stage, before everything was accented, to put the accent. Stenachon, or groaning, because stenachon must be read as baritone, like Oregon, stretching, and you see you have the reference here to another passage in the Iliad. And now the really interesting addition here, which makes it more complex than the first example, is that we have here an analogy that actually pertains also to the imperfect forms of these two verbs. So in the first analogy, we just had the participles, two participles were compared, right? Two participles compared, and the accent is used by analogy to temnon. In the second example, which already introduces actually a third and a fourth comparandum, the argument of Aristarchus is that we can use the analogy of Oregon because the imperfect forms of these two verbs are alike, right? So we have already a more extended analogy, and he takes other parts of the morphology into account. Now, the next example is of particular interest because we have a fight here against the nodatus. The question here is, what form should the name kalchas, here in the vocative, used in the vocative, what form should it have? Kalchan or kalcha? And as you see, Aristarchus is arguing here against the nodatus, because the nodatus writes kalcha without nun, but the nouns ending with as and the inflecting in nt, as in the genitive, have the vocative in nun. And then he gives another example, thoan eyan. Right, so we have thoas and ayas in the nominative, and these two other examples, they also produce their vocative in the same way that Aristarchus says should also apply to kalchas, namely kalchan. Now here you can see that the analogy that Aristarchus applies here already serves him to establish the correct version of the text, right? And he says, in fact, that Xenodotus got his grammar wrong when he wrote out his text. He did not pay attention to proper grammar. And proper grammar is learned from Homer himself. That's the important point. So in other words, Aristarchus is arguing here for a consistency within the Homeric text. And if in two other places we see that thoas turns to thoan in the vocative and ayas to ayan in the vocative, then that should also apply to kalchas. And therefore you cannot write kalcha as Xenodotus did. Okay, so you see that Aristarchus, as always, is very critical of Xenodotus. He can say terrible things about him, that he was basically kind of a complete ignoramus, having no idea about Homer and the Greek language, and being completely uncritical that there was in fact a fiddling with the text, right? And so Aristarchus accuses Xenodotus regularly of not paying attention to all the corruptions in the text, and he just went with them without, in fact, preserving the purity of Homer's text. So here again, we have only this fragment, and we don't have the whole context, but we can see that here too, Aristarchus, on grammatical grounds, is eager to preserve what he considers to be the authentic Homeric text against corruptions which Xenodotus kind of totally uncritically and freely just copied without any kind of scholarly judgment. And now in the last example, and I will skip for a moment the one in 1084, we see an even more critical remark about Xenodotus. Right, and the issue here is the word tree, and the question how the dative form should be written, not only accented but also written. So the text says they were sitting under a tree, right? Dendreo ephesomenoi. And then you see again, Aristarchus marked this, and he explains, Hottie Xenodotus graphe dendrei. So because Xenodotus wrote dendrei instead of dendreo. And then he dismisses this completely. And he says, the one who says dendros, namely who assumes that the nominative is dendros, like in kalos, will say dendrei, like kale. The one who says dendron, like bathron, will say or should say dendro, like bathro. But Homer says dendreon hypsipetelon, the tree with the many leaves in Iliad 13. So we have here again a case where Aristarchus says, well, if we study Homer very carefully from the beginning to end, we actually find a nominative that he mentions, and that's in a different passage, completely different passage. As you will see, here he deals with Iliad 352, and he goes to Iliad 13, 437. So you can see, of course, here the incredible control and command that Aristarchus had over the whole text. And he could simply remember this, the nominative being used in a completely different book. 13 books later, we have the nominative being mentioned, and he can simply recall this. At the same time, he criticizes Xenodotus for getting his grammar wrong, right? Because he says you cannot write dendre, because that would presuppose that it's the third declension like kalos, and then the form would be kale, and then dendros would be formed in the same way. But that's not the case, because Homer himself uses dendreon. So that's the different thing. And the same with bathron, from the second declension that would go to bathro. And again, this does not apply here, because the text itself has dendreo, and Homer, in a completely different context, says dendreo. Okay, so we see have a beautiful example here where Aristarchus goes very far to find the precise nominative form, and he refutes Xenodotus by bringing all these analogies and saying that he was not aware of them, and he did not, his text does not conform to Homer's own grammar. and the analogy that he should have been, the analogies that he should have been aware of the declensions, cannot be used in the way that Xenonitus put it. Right, so he makes great efforts. That's why I also asked about Itzig's, the grammar book, where here we are in a completely different environment of very educated readers, and readers who obviously demand a very solid answer to why a certain form can be used, and in a very careful attention to every single word, to every single accent, and very detailed explanations why one word or the other could be used. Now, poor Xenonitus has not come down to us except through the very harsh criticism of Aristarchus, and I guess we can suspect, as historians, we can suspect that he also had some reasons for his choices, but they have not come down to us. It's basically always Aristarchus saying, well, he didn't have the foggiest idea, and he doesn't let him speak for himself very much what his reasons may have been. But here again, you see that analogy serves to establish the correct text. It doesn't serve to explain it in a kind of broader hermeneutic sense, and it does not serve to set up a separate grammar, but it serves to establish the correct text. And it is precisely these kind of grammatical reasons that Aristarchus provided, which later led his student Dionysius Thrax to write what probably was the first Greek grammar, the Technicae Grammaticae, and to put it all together as kind of rules. But as you can see here, Aristarchus worked kind of the other way around. He had the text in front of him, and he wanted to establish the right, the correct version, and the kind of grammatical rules that he derived from the text within itself were in some ways a help or a byproduct of his major aim of establishing the text. And now the last example, which is kind of a bit amusing. Here also we are in the midst of a debate about the right text. And we have Nestor speaking here, and there is something surprising in the text, because he says, he asks, it's actually a question in the text, seeking one of your mules or one of your companions. So this is kind of an odd comparison, right? And indeed, Aristarchus jumps in and he athetizes the line. He says the line is not authentic. Homer did not write this odd line. And in any case, what is this comparison between mules and companions? And his reason is the following. He says the line is athetized because again, he assumes an interpolator wants to say ureon in the sense of senators, i.e. guardians, but he did not master the declension. To schrematos, and schrema is exactly the word that he uses for the declension, or the rules of the declension. For Homer says uros, sentinel, like kuros, right? So we have the uronton phylaka. He says hos kuronton phylaka, but he, the interpolator, says ureos, which is mule. So again, the idea is that the interpolator can be exposed because he didn't know the grammar well, and he didn't know Homeric grammar well enough. So he in fact wanted to say the senators, but he didn't realize that Homer wouldn't have expressed himself in that way, and that he wouldn't have he would have used a different word. So for Aristarchus, the case is very clear. Homer would not have written in this way. It doesn't conform to his ethos, to his customary speaking, and that's why this flaw must be attributed to somebody else again, of a far lower intellectual caliber, who got it wrong, interpolated, added a line which doesn't really conform to Homer. Now, with this last example, which again beautifully shows how aestheticis works for Aristarchus, also brings us to the question, of course, of the boundary of the text, and the question also of the idealization of Homeric language. Namely, when does Aristarchus stop to learn from the text as he has it in front of him, and when does he become prescriptive and says, well, this could not have been written by Homer, it's too bad, and therefore we actually include it from all the case studies that we could learn from, and this is actually a case that is exceptional, and in fact is interpolated, and therefore it doesn't teach us anything about Homeric language, right? And so the question of boundary and normativity comes in through the back door in the cases when the text is actually denied its Homeric origin and is said to be of something else. And some cases are quite clear where the language is pretty much all right, but Aristarchus makes a statement that, you know, he athetizes a certain line and he says it's so irrational, Homer would never have said this. So here it's not even on kind of pure grammatical grounds, but, you know, it's just a kind of, obviously he wouldn't have said such a, you know, stupid, silly thing. And so it's a very delicate dynamics here, I think, between the ideal of learning from the text as it is, and then applying it to questionable cases, and in fact ruling out certain lines as un-Homeric, and then excluding them from what we can actually learn about Homer. And that, of course, also brings us back to the question of anomaly and analogy, because if you exclude certain cases, then of course the Homeric language that you reconstruct will be more regular, because that's exactly what you do. And then once you have established the ethos, you can also exclude certain cases that don't conform to it. Rather than perhaps concluding that, okay, that was the way that Homer spoke, and maybe there is more room for diversity than for ethos in that particular case. So I leave this open, and perhaps just conclude with one further remark, that the enormous the issues here that Aristarchus discusses were really of incredible weight and of incredible importance in the ancient world. And as you can see, they pertain not only to grammar and to the development of grammar, as his students will develop and write up grammar books, but they also pertain to the way that readers can, in fact, relate to their canonical texts. Canonical in the sense that it is a text that provides inspiration, that provides the cultural paradigm for any other thing that may be written or conceived. And it also had a lot of influence on the Jewish exegetes in Alexandria, who also began to ask about the ethos of Moses when writing up the Bible. And interestingly enough, the Alexandrian Jews were really so much at home in the Greek environment that they basically assumed, they don't really say it, but they basically assumed that Moses wrote the Bible in Greek, because they all the time asked, well, why did Moses use this Greek word? Why did he not choose the right kind of paradigm for it? And it's very clear that they were so absorbed in the Alexandrian enterprise, in the cultural project, that they kind of forgot themselves and really kind of discussed the Bible as if Moses had written it, in fact, in Greek. And then they explained the style of the Septuagint by arguing, why Moses put the article first or put it late, and it has nothing to do with the biblical, with the Hebrew original text, but it is all in this operating on those grounds. But the revolution, of course, for Jewish Bible exegesis is that we have here for the first time a literary approach to the Bible, and it is in fact Moses as the author of the kind of Greek Bible is now in the foreground rather than God. And the Bible is analyzed according to literary methods pertaining to style and ethos, the literary custom that a certain author has. And I believe also that there were some kind of really daring exegetes who also corrected the text. In Alexandria, I think 2000 years approximately before the kind of modern text critical study started. And I think there were in fact Jews who did correct the text according to grammatical criteria, and we don't have them. For Hellenistic Judaism, we are completely dependent on the church fathers, and the church fathers took a more kind of conservative approach to the text. They were not into kind of correcting the text and literary exegesis, but we still have the testimony of Philo, and Philo at certain points gets kind of very well, kind of angry. It's kind of a grammar war. He doesn't like that some others, and I think there must have been Jews, actually corrected certain particles to make them grammatically more correct. And so I think we have the tip of the iceberg here, that actually these methods that Aristarchus provided in Alexandria were also taken very seriously by the Jewish intellectuals in Alexandria, and they on the basis of this, they actually introduced a revolution to the study of the biblical text, which it took many years to, in fact, come back to. So it's in some ways, as in Alexandria already, they knew that we live that the earth is round, and this was forgotten for many years, and they rediscovered it, and with great enthusiasm, and gave up the idea again of that we are living on a plate. So I think here we have a similar kind of paradigm shift, that some things are discovered very early, but they are so revolutionary that they are not widely accepted at their time, and then rediscovered independently at a much later stage. And Aristarchus, in some ways, I mean, the fact that his works also have not survived is also shows that his works were not considered to be worthy of being copied. And the grammar books of his students were copied in hundreds of copies, because they were much easier to read. You didn't have to, it was more normative, and you didn't have to get involved in all the details of all the particular examples. And so the easier kind of synthesis was copied, whereas the great foundation based on really detailed textual work was not copied in the same way. So I think that's, I guess that's something that we have to face when we study the humanities, and in particular the ancient world. So thank you very much, and I look forward to
so thank you for the talk. The last remarks you made about Moses, who
Greek writing.
Yeah, writing in Greek. It gives a twist to the Borgesian principle that the original is not faithful to its translation. The Bible was potentially written in Greek. By some odd accident, it happens to have survived in Hebrew. Something like that. It's an amazing example, and also shows you the depth of the intellectual world in Greek, which But I wanted to go back to Aristocracy in your examples, because, I mean, tell me how you feel about this. Or, I don't know, any of the classicists here. Examples are very remarkable. I can't help but feel that it's an attempt to impose a kind of grammatical uniformity on a text in which that uniformity is not necessarily present to begin with, whether for metrical reasons or dialectical. It looks like actually, I mean, we know this from Homer. There's a lot of metrical expansions and contractions, or because I don't know. I mean, they're dealing with Ionic, some kind of Ionic Greek, which is not. Well, I don't know. It has a particular authoritative status if it's coming from Homer. It's as if there was this argument from analogy about what you call proper grammar. You learn it from Homer himself. That makes good sense. We have good examples of something like that in South India. I'll be giving an example exactly like that today. But nonetheless, it does seem to assume some kind of regularity that may not actually have been present initially, right?
Yeah. Two things. One, going back to Moses and the Greek, interestingly enough, the only time that Philo shows awareness of his Greek being actually a translation from the Hebrew is in the Roman context, when he actually comes to Rome, and Rome is a very kind of multilinguistic environment, unlike Alexandria, where I think everything was basically in a Greek context, and also the library, it seems, they contain only translations. They didn't contain scrolls in other languages. So Rome is a complete different environment. You have Latin, you have Greek, you have other languages. And that's where Philo for the first time writes something about the Hebrew having been translated into Greek. And then of course he has to say, unlike Josephus, who could still read the Greek himself, the Hebrew himself, he says it was a perfect translation. And that's why we can, that's why we work with the Greek, because it's a perfect translation. Concerning the, yes, obviously there is an attempt to create a grammar from Homer. And obviously there is also I mean, what we know today of the kind of complexity of Homeric language, it seems that even Aristarchus was not fully aware of this complexity and the different, certainly not the different kind of the background in the Ionic dialect, and so I guess it's a question of. I mean, his project, I think, kind of reached and covered a certain amount of cases and got to a certain stage. And I guess the question is whether we kind of admire how far he got, or whether we say, well, there are all these other cases that actually either he cannot deal with, or he has to superimpose something that doesn't really fit the text. And again, I wish we had all of Aristarchus to get more examples of how he would deal with all these different cases. And of course, you're right that so much of the accentuation in Homer has to do with the meter. And then it's very difficult to derive a kind of an isolated grammar from this, where you have to see the word in context.
Because the principle, a later principle, the lectio wouldn't apply here at all. Actually,
Right.
If you had an irregular form, I guess a modern editor would be
Very happy about it. Yes. Indeed. Yeah. Yes.
You had a few more words to clarify Varro's understanding of analogia. How do you want to pass that? Because the translator that you gave us here, is this an old edition?
Yeah.
I don't know who it is, but uses
Inclinazione, that's what.
uses with regularity.
Yeah.
And that implies, as much of the discussion implies, that that's the meaning of analogy. First of all, the English analogy may not be correct
The Greek analogia.
In many cases,
Yeah.
it's a positive thing. It's a fixed pattern, normative pattern of usage. But then in our common speech, we often talk about analogy for language learners, children or students. That it's a source of error, right?
Mhm.
And even in this passage you gave us, Varro uses examples in which that's exactly what it is. He says, dense, mense, gents is a false analogy.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
what does that mean? And is there kind of valence to analogy? Is good or bad, or
No, the example that I gave, the mens gens, that's where he gives expression to the anomalists who say the analogy doesn't work, right? Because you can see here very similar words in sound and morphology, and they do not behave in the same way. So that shows that the analogy is not that. No, I think they question the value of this method. They say, well, analogy may not be such a great thing after all, because you see it produces the wrong results with these words. I think.
What does that do for the primary conception here that this is what makes language work? This is the essential pattern that you follow.
Yeah, so I think if I understood Varro correctly, I think that his attitude towards analogia is basically positive if it's not used kind of to the extreme. So I think that he would allow for analogia if as something that can be learned from kind of natural spoken language. There are certain rules, and that's what I think he would consider very positively. And he presents both views. He presents both views. I think that's what and he comes himself, positions himself between the two extremes. And that's why he has both opinions. Yes.
Just to add to that, I think Varro ends up with a position where he ends up defining analogia in very specific terms. So it excludes some of the analogies that don't work. So he ends up saying you need to compare at least two different features of a word in order before it's a valid analogia. There's a broader point as well about Varro that I think is very interesting for the broader themes of the conference, which is that he structures this book about Latin as a series of arguments.
Mm-hmm.
A series of grammatical wars. So there's a triadic structure where one book argues against a position, one book argues for a position, and then the third book provides a kind of synthesis. And so there are books about etymology. Can you know the origin of a word? No, you can't know it, but maybe you can know some things about it. And I think this dispute about analogy and anomaly is part of the same structure. And I think that's maybe relevant to your point about not finding the dispute so strongly in the Greek sources, because Varro has a reason here, because of the structure of his work, to kind of create an argument between Greek grammarians when maybe there isn't, or maybe not to the same degree. But maybe the bigger question that I have here is, why does Varro choose to construct Roman grammar about the history of Greek and Latin grammar as a series of disputes rather than, say, a tradition? I mean, he could say, okay, there's this unbroken tradition and I'm part of it. And maybe some people say some things a little bit, some people say a little differently, but I'm part of this tradition. But instead he says, okay, there are these fights. Here's pro, here's con, and here I am coming in as this Roman gentleman to solve the problem.
Yeah, I actually asked myself exactly the same question, and I think it has very much to do with the Roman discourse at that time. I mean, Cicero does something very similar. He also always sets up the different philosophical schools, and he said, one against the other. And then we also have the Roman law schools. They're also set up as usually as two schools fighting with each other. And I think it is very much, and Cicero says we have the best law in the world precisely because it's not one person who gave us the laws as it is with Pericles or Lycurgus in Sparta, but we are actually distinct because we have this ongoing debate, and it is through the debates that the kind of the best law in fact emerges. And I think the Roman intellectuals then could very easily kind of inscribe themselves into these disputes and actually bring the discussion to what they thought was the best result. And I think this also has to do with the way that the Greek tradition was in fact interpreted and reused and put to Roman purpose. Yes.
Two small questions. First, again, coming from someone who's not a classicist, so I'm not really familiar with the time frames. So, seeing I pronounced something right, Aristarchus, how far removed he was in time from Homer, and honestly, how far removed were these Hellenistic Jews from the translation of the Bible to Hebrew? Like, how
To Greek.
Yeah, to Greek. Yeah, I've been influenced. Yeah.
Philo was very successful.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, at the time of Philo, not all of the Septuagint had been completed yet. I mean, it started probably in the 3rd century. And we have letter of Aristeas, probably from around the same time, reporting about it. But this was only the Torah, the first 5 books, and the last books were still being translated. And there are also very different styles of translation. Some are more literal, some are much more, much freer. So in a way, this was still a kind of an ongoing process, which makes it even more surprising that Philo would speak that way. But then we also have to consider that the canonization of the prophets and the writings dates even further back. So perhaps as far as Philo is concerned, what we are really talking about is the 5 books of Moses, and that translation was fixed certainly ahead. But the Greek of the Septuagint is a rather peculiar Greek. It's pretty close to the Hebrew, and it's clearly pretty recent Greek. So in some ways, I guess Philo could have noticed that this is not a very archaic form of Greek that Moses would have written had he written it in Greek so many years back. The case with the Homeric text in Aristarchus, who was active in the 2nd century BCE. So the Homer experts tell me when the Homeric text was fixed. That met several I don't know, 800, 900 before. That's
Not
that's
900.
the 900.
800, 700, maybe 650, not later than
Okay.
650.
Okay, so we have.
So it's already like canonic
Yes.
in Greek society.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So my second question, besides that, more.
So some of the responsibilities of the Alexandrian grammarians then is also to explain words that were no longer familiar.
My second, I guess, once contrary, again, going back to the Greek Bible, I couldn't help but think of the quote from the play Pygmalion, where the English language is described as the language of Shakespeare and the Bible. And again, there it is, I think, the implication isn't that the Bible was originally written in English, but that the English translation is such a work of art that it goes further beyond the original. So I wonder, to what degree was that also the deal with the Hellenistic Jews, that they just thought that the Greek language was so superior to Hebrew that even if it was a translation, it somehow is able to.
Was sublime.
It's sublime, yeah.
Yeah. I guess the most striking point is that we don't really even get such discussions of this kind of comparison. The letter of Aristeas describes the translation, but and it says even something that it was written in Chaldean characters, the Hebrew, the original Hebrew, but it doesn't give an evaluation. It's very important there that the translators came from the land of Israel, that were sent by the high priest, and they had a kind of a bilingual paideia. They were trained in the paideia, the Jewish and the Greek paideia, but there is no real I mean, the striking fact in the letter of Aristeas is that the translation is described as a very kind of human project, and they compare their versions, and there's nothing yet of the miracle that we hear later in the Christian sources, who have a vested interest in making this a kind of a miracle, because that's their canonical text, as opposed to the Hebrew text, and there's nothing of that yet in the early Jewish traditions. So I guess people weren't really worried about it, and as I said, the emphasis on Moses as a human author, I think, made it, who kind of wrote it in Greek, made it a very special work that they didn't compare to anything else. Yes.
I have experienced a lot of people who misuse Greek texts, and they will do kinds of analysis on Greek texts that you can't do on a translation, but they're doing it on a translation, saying, oh, look, he uses this word here, that's really important. The word's not there in the Greek. And I see this all the time in my students. I would say it's the default thing for my students to do. And I see it way too often in people who are old enough to know better. And so I wonder, I mean, what I do as a teacher dealing with that is not tell them that it was written in Greek. They know it was written in Greek. They don't think that Euripides was writing in English. What they don't understand is what you can do with a translation and how different languages are different. And I wonder if that's actually what's going on. Not that anybody thinks that Moses was writing in Greek, but the people are not grasping the limitations of a translation when it comes to revealing what the original said.
Yes, you are of course right. Nobody says Moses wrote in Greek, of course, but the kind of question that Philo puts to the Greek text, asking what was Moses' intention in using this word, you must assume, yes, that either it's a perfect reflection of the Hebrew, and that's why we can deal with it on the level of the Greek, because it's a perfect reflection.
Or it's a perfect reflection of Moses's thought, because he has not really thought about the fact that Greek and Hebrew are so different from each other. Because that's certainly what my students are doing, that they just don't get that the translation does not always reflect the original, that you're having to make choices and it's not the same text. And they don't know that. And I'm wondering if you could have a situation like that where people just aren't thinking about the limitations of a translation.
Well, the problem here is that they're not, I mean, I guess you students are just thinking about the ideas, right?
No, they also think about the words.
Style, about the style.
They will talk about the style, they will talk about the words.
Okay.
Why did Euripides put this word here? And it makes me want to cry, but I get it over and over again. It's obviously a really common tendency.
Yeah.
So it's part of not living in a multi-linguistic world, like thinking in one language.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. These are the monolingual students.
Right.
Yes. I heard the criticism about America there.
It's England. For the record, it's England.
Joseph?
Oh, I mean, just worried about your remark about Moses as the author. You do find that, of course, in early medieval interpreters of the Bible, like Ibn Ezra.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Yeah.
And you really wonder whether or not there would be some way of finding, whether there were traces in the air that made their way right into the, into the Arabic literature, Islamic literature, early Islamic literature, and then to Ibn Ezra and the early commentators.
Well, of course, I'm more than happy to find such traces, but I need you to give them to me.
You definitely have very early on. The other thing which I think is very interesting is that, when the Judeans returned from Babylonia, they're facing the same problems that these that Aristarchus is facing with, they don't know how to pronounce many words, all right? They don't know how to parse, the verses, all right? But what you don't have is sort of trying to fix the text. Instead, you have the explosion of the oral Torah and all these rabbinic interpretations, just the opposite direction. And that's, I think, a real contrast between sort of the Greek cultural climate and, the rabbinic climate in Palestine. So, but I want to ask you something else. In the very beginning, you were contrasting analogy and, this rules and proportion with, so as being characteristic of the written text as opposed to oral speech. Is there any, does that reflect any, views going back to Plato about the dangers of writing of the written speech as opposed to the oral? Is that in the background of these discussions as well? So the speech should be prior to the written text?
Yeah, I also wondered about the Phaedrus when I read Varro. I didn't. First of all, I didn't see it in Aristarchus in his discussions. I mean, it seems to me that the way that Plato formulated is different from Varro's, because in Plato you have the great concern that the kind of writing down a dialogue, a lively discussion, it kind of fixes it and may distort it, and I think most dangerously is can also isolate the text from the audience, and so then the author can no longer explain the individual questions that are actually put to his ideas, and so you get this kind of isolation between what the author had in mind and what any reader can actually pick up, because there is no kind of intimate relationship anymore. And it seems to me that Varro's concern is very different. That what he says is that there is also this kind of spoken dimension, and as far as I can see, he seems to be quite positive about it. I don't think that he posits such a kind of a painful discrepancy between the two as Plato experienced, and of course with Plato, as Margalit Finkelberg always explains, there is of course this great irony that he was the greatest writer who put his dialogues in writing and was extremely successful with it, and so we have this incredible kind of tension there, creative tension, which I don't think is Varro's interest here. And in any case, my sense is, we will hear about Plato later, but my sense in any case is, again, from my studies about Philo and Josephus, that Plato was not as admired in Rome as he was in Alexandria, for example. I mean, in Alexandria, he was clearly a canonical text, and Francesca Schironi in another article has also argued that Aristarchus may also have edited some of Plato's texts, and the reading was established, the order of reading his dialogues was established in Alexandria. He was admired and everybody knew him by heart next to Homer, and in Rome I think many kind of even despised him a little as being kind of up in the air and not being practical and efficient. And Josephus says very explicitly that his symposium was kind of despised. And this whole thing also about homosexuality, that the Romans really kind of critiqued and as un-Roman and unmanly. So I think Plato came on this side of the inefficient Oriental, being busy with little boys, and his ideas were not seen as being very practical. And Socrates then also is interpreted in a kind of completely un-Platonic fashion, namely simply as a kind of not as having great ideas, but as being showing endurance and being a martyr, and that's that's a good Roman thing to do, to put up with a tyrant and endure pain. But there's nothing of his ideas that actually comes across in Valerius Maximus or in Cicero. So I think there is a real shift from Alexandrian admiration of Plato and Roman ambivalence. Yes.
Well, thank you for this fascinating talk, and I think very different kinds of layers of looking at the theme of this school that come up. One is the kind of the question of intellectual history. This kind of wars took place or were some constructed retroactively. And the second is about literary criticism and philology. Who really is Homer? Is an interesting question that comes up. Is Homer kind of a construct of philologists, or is it? The third question that I think is that at the heart of this is about a tension in language and grammar between anomaly and analogy, between regularity and irregularity. And what I wonder is, to what extent is the Aristocracy aware of the question of this being a theory rather than this being a fact? And to what extent is he willing to decide based on criteria that apply to different theories, such as economy, for example? Or to what extent does he think that this is language? That to me is a fascinating question.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this really continues your question on a further dimension. I guess a test case, who is Homer for Aristarchus, maybe the famous puzzle that obviously the epos doesn't ever mention writing. And so the puzzle for the scholars was that they said, well, all these Greek heroes, they were in fact, were they in fact analphabets? Did they not know how to read and write? And yet they are at the source of all learning and civilization. And there is one word, I can't remember now where in the Iliad, where somebody gets semea, the signs, and then there are some kind of apologists who say, oh, the semea, the signs, they are the letters. And Aristarchus says, no, it says semea, they're not letters, they are signs. And the early Greeks, the heroes described in the epos there, they were not sophisticated readers, and they didn't know how to read and write. So he does make this kind of historical distinction between us as the greatest civilization and our heroes, who actually had no idea about writing and reading. And he's remarkably unapologetic here, unlike others. And you can see there is another war going on in Alexandria, because there were apologists who tried to bend Homer to describe the Greek heroes as obviously reading and writing. To what extent was he aware of kind of constructing rather than discovering a kind of a language? I guess, again, given our limited evidence with all the fragments that have, and all these commentaries that have been lost, I probably think that he thought that he's tracing the language as it was used by Homer. That's kind of my sense, and that's also why he is very intolerant of other reconstructions, and they are simply wrong, and they don't understand the grammar. That would be kind of my sense.
Yeah. The debate on the grammar of Greek is centered around the text of Homer. is there any argument given how language of a text is, the grammar of a text is the grammar of the language in general? In Sanskrit, there are two kinds of glossaries. One is clearly a lexicon for text, and another is a lexicon of the language. No, saying that both are the same.
How
But
very
why is it
interesting.
not different for grammar? Grammar of the language in text is the grammar of the language in general. There must be some argument for that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And again, if we had more of Aristarchus, he may have mentioned something. The fact is that he distinguishes Homeric language from that of the Neoteroi, the younger ones, the more recent ones, and that's what we usually today we have collections of these kind of pseudepigraphic writings, and Aristarchus is always very clear that the Neoteroi, the youngsters, the more recent writers, that they are always less reliable, less worthy, and thus also less normative in terms of their Greek.
But he doesn't think that everybody should write like Homer.
No.
So
No.
he's not constructing the grammar of the language from the text. He's interpreting Homer through Homer because he recognizes that Homer's different from what we ordinarily do. And therefore Homer's not the model for what we're supposed to do.
But is there not some kind of correlation? I mean,
Homer
obviously
is
he's
of course
interpreting
better.
Homer.
Of course,
Yeah.
Homer's better, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean Homer's our model when it comes to language. He doesn't think we should write Homeric Greek.
Yes, but I guess the question becomes very, very acute in the next generation when Greek grammars, I mean, yes, Aristarchus does not construct a Greek grammar, right? That's the main point here, that he does not write the technical grammar. But then when we get to Dionysius Thrax, we do have a Greek grammar, and we do have, I guess you would agree that we do have here a grammar of the Greek language, and yet many examples are still from Homer.
Yes, but that's, I mean, sometimes Homer conveniently coincides with what we should still do today. By we today, I mean like in Alexandria in the 2nd century BC, of course, let's make that clear.
Yes.
But I don't think any of those Alexandrians would have said everything that's in Homer is normative for us. Dionysius Thrax wouldn't have said that. None of them would have said that because it just was obviously not true.
But then obviously they did not recommend that people should now write in Homeric Greek, and Aristarchus himself doesn't write in Homeric Greek, so that's very clear. But isn't there some sense that there's some kind of basic, like the declination and I mean, all this is somehow derived from Homer for more than just his text?
I mean, I think that's true, but I also think that goes with picking and choosing. So there are Homeric forms which are still good as models. There are other Homeric forms you would not use as a model. And when you're trying to come up with good examples, the text of Homer is an excellent place to look because everybody knows it. And also because it scans, it's harder to corrupt it. In transmitting your text, if you've got something metrical, it's more like the example is more likely to survive. So there's all kinds of good reasons to use an example from Homer, but and I'm not saying Homer doesn't have authority, but that's not the same as saying everything that's in Homer is authoritative for us.
Yes, but I would still think that Aristarchus thought that he also kind of describes kind of slightly more general grammar, which of course he derives from Homer for Homer. Yes, and of course they themselves are writing in a different Greek, which probably they thought still follows along similar grammatical lines as Homer. Is Eitan?
So, wondering a discussion about Animalism, whether anyone ever reasons from another language, right? So does Bible ever say, like, where it's talking about this first declination masculines? Does anyone ever say, well, you know, also in Greek, and therefore this also stands to reason, or vice versa? Or is this not at all part of the discourse?
I let the Latinist answer for
The
Varro.
Romans sometimes reason from Greek. The Greeks do not reason from.
Exactly, that's exactly like what, yeah, and not from any other language other than Greek.
And yeah, Vera does mention Egyptian, I think, and
Oh,
when,
really?
when he talks about the fact that languages have inflection generally, that the endings of nouns change based on what function they're serving, he does cite other languages, but I think that's the only passage where he seems to know about a language other than Greek and Latin.
Thank you very, very much. Well, we are breaking for a late lunch. We resume at 2:15 here in this room. I should also mention that on Wednesday night, restaurant.
Yes, right.
We don't have Alexandria. as you said.
Not taking sides.
For example, on the question of translation.
Maybe half of us should go to